Good morning, everybody. I'm Robert Scheer, and this is your 6 AM Wake Up. We've spent a lot of time talking about steps. There's 12 of them. There's also 12 traditions, which I will get into at some point in the future, at least a few of them. And there's also a number of principles. A lot of these principles of 12-step are not necessarily codified. They're sort of informal. One of them was principles before personalities, and we talked about that previously. There's all kinds of slogans that represent these principles, and one of the principles is not to judge your insides by somebody else's outsides. And what that means is don't let somebody's seeming good fortune, good job, good house, everything seems to be going well for them, make you feel like you're not enough, because everybody's got their issues and everybody's got their problems. The converse or inverse of that is don't judge somebody by their outward appearance. So if somebody seems downtrodden or socioeconomically not where you're at, doesn't mean they're not a wonderful person. And these lessons, principles, are always being reinforced for me when I attend meetings, but more importantly, life. I see examples of them all the time. So I'm going to share a story. I'll try to be brief, but it's a really great story. One of my favorites that happened to me about 20 years ago. So I was actually in the Bahamas, staying at the Atlantis Resort with my partner. She and I had just met fairly recently, and we were away on an early vacation. And this was a time in my recovery when another slogan, meeting makers make it. So I was hell-bent on going to a meeting every day. And I don't know where I learned of it, but I found or researched a meeting that was in the Bahamas, in the country. And so I called a cab, and I got in the cab. I gave him the address. And so the cab and I were out, took off. And we took off, and it took a long time. We were probably a good 30 minutes outside of all the resorts and all the nice areas where people stay, and really in a more rural, impoverished part of the country. And we were looking for this meeting, and we couldn't find it. And the neighborhood became increasingly a little scary. There were broken furniture in the yards. There were dogs on leashes sort of barking at us when we went by. I remember seeing fences with barbed wire. And it was getting later. I think the meeting started, around 7 or 8 o'clock. So it was getting dark. And I was getting more and more apprehensive. And frankly, the cab driver was getting a little apprehensive about where we were, because we were driving really slow, literally 2-3 miles an hour, almost like casing the neighborhood, because we were looking for a house number or a number for where this meeting was supposed to be. We never found that house number, but eventually on a telephone pole, literally, was a sign, a placard, nailed to the sign, and it had the NA symbol. You may be familiar with it. So, okay, here's where we are. And I was reluctant to get out because it just didn't seem safe, frankly. And I also didn't know how I was going to get back. So I asked him if he could pick me up, and he said, sure. And he gave me a card and said, call me. But I got the feeling, I got the strong impression that he was like, sure, call me, meaning, no way in hell I'm coming back here. Anyway, I go into this meeting, and as I'm going in the meeting, I start to see the familiar signs on the wall, 12 steps and all the different slogans and things like that. So I kind of knew I was in the right place, and I felt at home. And there was only 3 or 4 people in there. I was maybe the third. And it turned out it was a celebration meeting. Somebody was recognizing a certain amount of time clean. I don't remember. And I sat there. And as the meeting went on, they're always an hour. By the end of the meeting, I was feeling pretty relaxed. I at least felt safe in there. All of my prejudices and misgivings had sort of melted away. But now I'm thinking, how am I going to get out of here? And so I see a phone on the wall. This is before cell phones, by the way. I didn't have a cell phone. I was stuck there. I see a phone on the wall, and I ask somebody how I get out. And he says, well, why? Where are you going? Something like that. And my alarms went right back up. Where are you going? He said. And I'm like, well, I've got a ride, trying to make it seem like somebody was expecting me. He said, no, and I'm not going to attempt to do a Bahamian accent, but he said, no, you're not. You're coming with us. Long story short, coming with them meant 2 houses down, they were throwing a party for this celebration. And I mean, it was a party. They had, their own band, a reggae band. They were dancing. They had jerk chicken. They had all kinds of true local food. And I was, not the center of attraction for any particular reason, but maybe just because I was a visitor. And they treated me like royalty. And I had the best evening and danced, and they sang, and I ate. And, it was just a spectacular evening, one that I really, 20 years later, remember pretty darn vividly. At one point, somebody comes up to me and says, don't you worry. You just let us know when you need to go. The party's going on, but I got to get back. I know that, remember, I don't have a phone. So my partner's worried about me. Where have I been? I've been gone for hours. And I finally say to somebody, I'm ready to leave. And sure enough, this guy comes around. His car looked like it was assembled from other cars. It wasn't, it was different pieces of cars bolted together to make this car. And he and what I think was his wife, they drove me back to the Atlantis resort. A little footnote on that, by the way, when we got to the resort, they were questioned because locals aren't allowed in the resort, or you have to have a guest pass, and they don't really issue guest passes. So they had to explain they were taking me, and I had to sort of verify it. But what a great example of not judging the book by its cover, right? And that memory has stayed with me all these years. I hope you enjoyed that story, but I hope more importantly, you get the meaning behind it. Thanks for listening to my thoughts for the day.